So, welcome to the first of our webinars, a webinar centering on child first effective partnership practice. That's really important. The genesis of our work began in 2015, 2016, when Microlink and the Association of Youth Offending Team Managers were simply given a DFE MOJ contract to secure better outcomes for young people with special educational needs in youth justice pathways. It originally focused on EHCPs, but on our assistance, we wanted to look at all young people with SEN support in schools, perhaps, and other needs, and to look at their history and involvement too. And very quickly, we realized something quite astonishing and quite concerning. Nearly every child who enters a youth justice pathway has degrees of complex needs. And that was, if you like, our kickoff point. Can we do something? Can we put something together to help teams meet those needs more effectively? So we came up with the Youth Justice Send Quality Assurance Framework, a bank of 10 questions against which you could self-rate yourselves. Um, we're doing it. We're not doing it. We're doing it, but we haven't got evidence for it. And we delivered two levels of certificate. One was the quality mark, which meant, yep, you've got your deck chairs lined up, well done. And quality lead status, which means those lined up deck chairs are already securing better outcomes for young people with special educational needs. And we're absolutely delighted to have a roll of honour going back to April 2018 of a wide number of local authority partnerships that achieved the quality mark. As you can see, some right at the beginning of the project in 2018 and others who have entered the programme sequentially. The award lasts for 3 years, at which point you redesignate. And many of these quality mark areas with the lined up deck chairs are then submitted for quality lead. And other local authority areas went straight for that quality lead mark. I should have, it all happened too fast then. Let's see if it comes back again. Yeah, we have a number of youth offending services who have got that quality lead status. Here they come. But something did get us quite interested, and that was we realised that quality lead status came out of what was effective partnership working. It wasn't just the youth offending services; it was the partners that worked with the youth offending services that helped them to get this quality lead status. And so we decided to look at what else was happening. And in this last 3 years, an awful lot has happened. There's been a real focus on prevention, a real focus on diversion, and a real focus on securing better outcomes for young people. These are sort of strategic intent and decisions that are being made. And guess what? They aligned 100% to things that we've been saying within our framework since 2016. Not surprising, because we had a team of 30 specialists from Youth Justice, from SEND, from the government, from MOJ, from YJB, from the Association of Youth Offending Team Managers, helping to create it. So we decided to do something more with our award. We decided to add to the quality lead level a child first commendation, that recognized effective partnership practice. And since we introduced it early last year, you can see a wide range of youth offending teams, including Milton Keynes, have attained this level. On the third Wednesday of every month until July, we're going to celebrate a different team doing something rather special, rather different. And today it is my absolute pleasure to introduce two colleagues from Milton Keynes, Diz and Jenna. Diz and Jenna are going to explain what they have done to close certain loopholes. I think, Diz, you call them tributaries, don't you? The tributaries that flow down the river and feed the youth justice system. And I'm going to hand over to them now. I really hope you enjoy the presentation, and there'll be time at the end for questions. And if you have any as they emerge, please pop them in the chat box. Diz, Jenna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marius, and welcome everybody. We're just in the process of doing the technical bit of sharing our screen. Just by way of a very brief introduction before we kind of get into this. So I'm Diz Minnitt. I'm the YOS manager and strategic lead for exploitation in Milton Keynes. My colleague Jenna Palmer leads on all of our out of court disposals, including our early support project and the PRE, which is what this is focusing on today, which is our promoting reintegration and reducing exclusion model, which is part of our, as Marius correctly says, our approach of going up the tributaries to youth justice. So the branding that we use for both ESP and PRE is very definitely not youth offending team or youth justice focused. It's about it being a non-stigmatizing, non-labeling approach to helping us identify children's needs at the earliest opportunity, so that all of those working with them can actually work with them more effectively to prevent them ever coming anywhere near the youth justice system. Anyway, without further ado, I'll allow Jenna to introduce herself, and then we'll jump into the presentation proper.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. My name's Jenna Palmer, and I manage the out-of-court disposals at Milton Keynes Youth Justice and Support Service. That includes our diversion and prevention service, which, as Diz was rightly saying, is rebranded differently to kind of our statutory and formal work within our youth justice setting.
So we're just trying to make the slides go forward. Which,
there we go.
There we go.
Apologies, I'm trying to go back.
There we are. That's it. That's the easiest way to do it.
Brilliant. Sorry about that. So what we wanted to do was to start off. So we're here today to talk about our promoting reintegration and reducing exclusions model, which is a speech and language therapy project that we have operating in primary and secondary schools in Milton Keynes. And we thought it'd be useful to start off with looking at why we put this work so high up on our agenda. And so we wanted to outline really in terms of some recent and maybe not so recent statistics around speech and language, but also the crossover in terms of emotional and behavioural difficulties, communication difficulties that children and young people can experience. So as you'll see, more than 60% of young people involved within the youth justice system are considered to have unrecognised, largely unrecognised speech and language difficulties. And that goes back to Brian's work in 2007. But there's been some more recent information since then, and this has come from Youth Justice Board Asset Plus data, which suggests that 71% of young people have speech and language difficulties. But as this is often hidden kind of difficulties and disabilities, it's not always recognised before coming through to a youth justice setting. Interestingly, 57% of children that have been diagnosed with language difficulties are also considered to have emotional and behavioural disorders. And that goes back to some work done by Benner in 2002. And lastly, 81% of children with emotional behavioural disorders can have significant identified communication needs. And we'll come on a little bit, we'll go on to talk about this a little bit further later, a little bit further on, to look at actually in terms of why communication and unpicking communication and behaviour is so key within this work. Okay, so in terms of our kind of local picture, so in 2018, we had what we call a predicted harm analysis. It was completed by partner organisations, and it was identified that 35 young people, out of 35 young people, 25 had previously had some involvement with what was Milton Keynes Youth Offending Team at that point. At least 92% of those 25 young people had identified speech, language and communication difficulties. And of that 92%, 79% did not have their needs identified prior to our involvement. So the remaining 8% also had a formal diagnosis of ADHD. So what we could conclude from that is that 100% of that cohort of children did have additional needs. In December 2021, we went on to identify that the percentage of young people who had speech, language and communication needs before being referred to either the early support project, which I'll come on to discuss later, this is what our speech and language project sits under within our service, before being referred to us was around 15%. So the amount of young people that had their needs identified was only 15%. Some more recent data, so between 2021 and 2022, of the 86 young people that had been assessed by our speech and language team, so that's all young children open to either our early support, out of court or statutory work, 87% were found to have had identified speech, language and communication difficulties. And although I picked this point up further, I think it's useful to bring in here that out of the young people that were assessed specifically under this project, 31 children in total between 2021 and 2022, 96% of those children assessed had identified speech, language and communication needs. And we'll go on to discuss that and unpick that a little bit further in terms of what did that look like, and also how we work to kind of support and promote.
And just before we move on, just to contextualise the predicted harm analysis, this was actually an analysis not of youth offending team data, but of children's social care and police data. And the analysis was looking at right across all of the available recordings to see which children were at the greatest risk of being involved in gangs or at greatest risk from gangs. So the 35 that were identified without any reference to youth offending team data. So the bit where we looked at the cohort that had been through the youth offending team was after the analysis had already taken place. So it was a useful kind of double blind addition to the first study.
Thank you. Okay, so this is just to kind of put, I suppose, speech, language and communication on the map in terms of Milton Keynes, really, in terms of some research that we've undertaken from our service, going back to 2019. So looking at 2019 to 2020, we assessed 80 young people for speech, language and communication difficulties, and 80% of those children did have an identified need. Moving on to 2020 and 2021, of the 97 young people that we assessed during that period, 84% had identified speech and language difficulties. And then again in 2021 to 2022, of the 86 young people that we assessed, 87% had identified speech and language needs. So as we can see, there's an increasing trend year on year of young people being identified as having a speech and language need.
So this is what we've previously kind of characterised as the road to nowhere. It kind of fits in line with both Karen Bryan and other people's research originally. So what we know is that if untreated, 33% of children with communication needs will develop mental illness, and over 50% of them will become involved in criminal activity. 81% of children with emotional behavioural disorders, as Jenna has previously identified, have unidentified language difficulties. And another study by the Children's Communication Council identified that 88% of unemployed young men had communication needs, and that compares to 8% in the general population. So what we know is that it's this increased prevalence and the long-term difficulties that kind of flow from that. So that this is just a bit of an amusing diagram to kind of capture that picture, really, the cliff edge of those difficulties being unidentified and the outcome of that. So one of the key focuses that we've looked at specifically all the way through is that behaviour is a symptom, not the cause. And that is what drew us very much into, as Maria says, going further up the tributaries. And just to put that in a bit of context, the points at which we were doing this and started a lot of the work around speech and language in the youth justice system was very much because the sort of changes that came out when austerity came in, where you saw services reducing their provision, having to sort of cut back what they were focusing on. And what we saw locally was SEND provision, which had previously been going into schools, be that education psychologists or other assessments, and was not being automatically sort of requesting funding up front. Schools were then placing the decisions of having to pay for these services rather than actually having them provide. And so we very quickly identified that the likely long-term knock-on effect was that children's needs would be missed because schools were having to make those difficult choices between provision that would meet the needs of a group of children or specific provision to identify the needs of one individual child, which, you know, is a false economy ultimately. So when we start looking at the influences and causes of behaviour when we're looking at speech language communication need, this diagram, which actually comes from, I'm trying to think where it does come from originally, now I've forgotten, but I think it's included in one of the microlink previous resources that was there, sort of showing the reason that we focus on speech and language needs is because it overlaps so many other difficulties. So when you start looking at comorbidities or sort of co-occurrences, as we tend to say, it's the speech and language assessment gives you a far greater insight into a whole host of other potential needs. It won't definitively identify them, but what it does do is it points you in the direction of where you're going in relation to looking for other needs and understanding the child's journey up until that point. But most importantly, if you don't understand that the child has got speech language and communication needs, you're effectively broadcasting on long wave and they're receiving on FM. So in terms of looking at the overall prevalence, we know that in some areas of deprivation, then up to 50% of children will start school with speech language and communication needs. And that's in the context of nationally 10% of children have long-term speech language and communication needs. And of those, it's not of the 10%, but 7.5% of children will have a developmental language disorder. So when we're looking at developmental language disorder, when we're considering that in the context of Milton Keynes, that would be a child who has a diagnostic level of moderate or above. Now, just again to contextualize that, if a child has mild speech language needs, forget the fact that the phrase makes it sound as though it's just a sprinkling of speech and language needs. That means that child has got greater needs than 84% of their peers. A child with a moderate need would have a greater level of need than 94% of their peers. And those with severe needs would have a greater need than 98% of their peers. And it's, as part of the overall population, those that would fall into the 98% category is 1% of all children.
Okay, so in terms of looking at why we decided to look at this in closer detail in terms of our liaisons and partnership working with our primary and secondary schools, initially secondary, which I'll come on to in a bit in terms of how that model actually developed over time. It's just useful to consider some of the emerging research that was making links between behavioural difficulties, communication needs, and school exclusions, now suspensions, and looking at why this work is so important in terms of what we're trying to achieve and what we're kind of recognising in terms of trends so far. So a study of secondary age pupils at risk of school suspensions found that in a high proportion of the pupils, language difficulties were a factor in their behaviour problems and their school suspension. Work done by Clegg back in 2004 also looked at a study of pupils at risk of suspension from school, and 2/3 were found to have speech, language and communication needs. In 2005, there's further work that was done around excluded males, and 100% had undetected communication needs and behavioural issues. And more recently, for the Department for Education in 2018, children with an identified special educational need accounted for 46.7% of all permanent exclusions, and slightly lower, 44.9% of fixed period exclusions. So it was this emerging research over several years that led to us considering our partnership working with schools and how to effectively push upstream. So rather than waiting for these children to come through an early intervention or a youth justice service, actually looking at what could we do to support schools around speech and language at a much earlier stage. And so that brings us on to the model that we operate and the projects that we have in place. So promoting reintegration and reducing exclusions has roughly been operating for around 5 years. We started off offering the service to secondary schools, mainly because we did an analysis of the young people that we had on our caseload over a 2-year period, and looked at what schools were we finding were most prevalent within that 2 years that our children were coming from, approached those schools initially, so there was some targeting of those schools to see whether or not they wanted to accept and kind of come on board the project. And we had a very, very good take up from secondary schools. Naturally, as other schools started to hear about the project, we had a lot of other secondary schools approaching us, asking if they could be part of the service as well. I think from the very, very early days of the project, people that we were liaising with from the education providers were very kind of keen to have this embedded within their provisions, but they were also very positive and enthusiastic about a project that was trying to support young people at the earliest stage. So the take up was very good. Then after the secondary school offer, a lot of the secondary schools were saying that actually what we're finding is the transitions between primary and secondary can be really, really difficult and challenging for some children. And so they effectively challenged us to see whether or not we could offer the service to primary schools. And again, we initially did targeting around those primary schools to see what were the feeder schools for our most prevalent secondaries. And then again, as the word kind of got around, we had more and more primary schools that have wanted to come on board. So we currently have 29 schools, and that includes our local college that are on the project. So over the years, it has grown, developed as a service. Now, in terms of what we offer, it's completely free. So it is free speech language therapy provision. And what that looks like in our model is offering assessments to children that schools have identified or provisions have identified as being at the greatest risk of school suspensions and managed move to alternative provisions. Now, that being said, we also work with one of our key alternative provisions, which is excellent. And so recognising the reintegration part of the project and actually supporting those children whilst in alternative education is also really key. And so one of the things that I suppose is most key about the project is it's all around early identification of speech language communication needs. And it effectively enables the school using whichever process they want to. So some schools might use a behaviour matrix, however they want to identify children that are at the greatest risk of suspensions or being moved to alternative education or managed moves to other schools, actually being able to fast track them through for a speech and language assessment. It's really, really key. And I think this is when we talk to the schools and find out actually what's been most important to them, it is around being able to have a very timely assessment completed, which when you compare it to referrals that go through to our kind of our mainstream, our schools team in terms of speech and language, is a lot quicker. Okay, so to talk about what the model actually looks like in practice. So what we operate is effectively an assessment model. So we want to offer assessments to children and young people, as many children and young people as we possibly can that have been identified by the school. What we don't do within that model is offer ordinarily ongoing interventions with that child or young person. And the reason for that is because A, due to capacity and demand, so being able to assess as many children as possible enables us to make sure that those needs are identified. But actually the approach that we adopt in Milton Keynes is we offer free speech, language and communication needs training to all the provisions that take part. That's the primary and the secondary provisions. And effectively, we try and support schools to upskill their teaching staff, their behavioural staff, support staff, to be able to recognise and identify speech and language, but also to be able to address it effectively within a school classroom setting. So that's the model that we undertake, and that's so that we can assess as many children as possible. There have been occasions where if children have considered to have a severe need or a moderate to severe need, and actually there is a specific piece of work that is required, and then effectively signpost into the school to carry on that work. There have been occasions where we've been able to offer that, but that's very kind of far and few between, purely due to capacity. So in terms of how this operates with schools, we have a short referral form and privacy notice that we ask the schools to complete. They are effectively obtaining parental consent, so we don't do that ourselves, that's for the school. Our service level agreement is between ourselves and the provision. So once parental consent is has been given and the referral form has been submitted, then it gets passed to one of our speech and language therapists to complete a assessment. And we use formal and informal assessments. So we use industry approved frameworks such as the KELF, but we also use observational bespoke tools that the speech and language therapists have developed, mainly due to the complexity of young people that we experience and that we assess. And that's very much on a case by case basis. And then what we do is we complete a full assessment report, and that is provided to the education setting for the education setting to share with parents and carers. Now, we have built in recently a process within our model where if the parent consents, that the speech and language therapist can talk directly to them. So to get their feedback, to obtain their observations, to be able to understand from a parental perspective, in addition to the schooling perspective, actually whether or not there are any concerns, particular kind of things that we need to pick up on within the assessment. And as I go through, we'll talk about that in terms of the signposting that we do on the back of the project. And like I say, we offer free speech and language training to all of the provisions. And so far we've had a very good response, but I'll come on to that a little bit later.
So this is just really an illustration of the reasons and the kind of presenting behaviours for children who have speech language communication needs. And this was sort of developed really as just a series of sort of little visual cues really representing each of those, because and it came out of the one particularly where we're talking about masking difficulties, because we often talk about children presenting squidding. Behaviour is squidding. When children are kind of reacting in behavioural ways, it's often that they're trying to get you to leave them alone, to sort of back off. And so again, it links into things like the defence mechanism, deflecting attention, distracting, and just trying to disguise their behaviours, because children tend to have some sense that they may have some difficulties. But what we also know is from some of the research we did many, many years ago, the more complex those needs, the less likely the child is to have any insight into the needs. So those that have severe needs tend to believe that they've got no needs at all. In terms of kind of carrying on with the statistics, so as Jen, I think, alluded to previously, 86 young people who had contact within that 2021 period were sort of identified. And of those, it was the ones that came through the pre were made up 36% of that group. And of the pre-cohort, 96% of the children were assessed as having identified speech, language and communication needs. So when we can see the prevalence of those in the wider youth justice system has been increasing over the years, with that figure going from 80% to 84% to 87% in Milton Keynes. In this cohort, which is even earlier, and those at greatest risk of coming into the system, those that we are focusing on, that prevalence is 96%.
Can I also, sorry, just to add to that as well, I think what's quite interesting about kind of this information, if we look at just specifically in Milton Keynes, that actually, as you can see, the diversion and prevention and this project, which sits under diversion and prevention, did make up the majority of the referrals for speech and language. And I think it is about just very much making sure that speech and language is very central to what we do in Milton Keynes. And in terms of the level of needs identified for those children, our aim would be that the majority of those children, if any at all, would come through to the youth offending team or any sort of early intervention, given the amount of work that goes into action planning and supporting the schools following that speech and language assessment. So I included this because I thought this would be useful actually in terms of like breaking down what levels of need we have identified in this specific project. And as you can see, as Diz suggested earlier, in terms of the levels of need, although they might have terms such as mild, moderate and severe, actually what you're talking about even with mild needs is very considerable. Where a young person's needs are greater than 84% of those peers really is significant. Now, as you can see, in terms of the levels of need that we had identified between 2021 and 2022, the majority of those young people assessed under this project were considered to have moderate speech language needs. So their needs were greater than 84% of their peers. And I thought this was really useful to include, to actually look at the breakdown in terms of what are we identifying when we do these assessments, and what that then means for those individual children and schools, which we'll come on to a little bit later.
Yep.
So again, I thought this would be really useful to kind of look at in terms of we have this speech and language project in schools, and we do an assessment and we do consultations with school staff and we do action planning at the end of those assessments to look at this is what we suggest needs to happen next for the individual children, and at times where trends and patterns have been identified within particular schools, we will also then suggest and recommend certain training or certain approaches that the school might want to adopt in terms of trying to support more young people, so being more influential than just that individual child alone. But actually, in terms of our signposting and referring, I would say referring on, this is one of the biggest areas in terms of this project. And just to give you, I mean, you can see there in terms of the visual representation, that actually, as a result of the assessments that we complete under the project, we do a great deal of signposting onto for communication assessments, so kind of ASD assessments. I would say out of all of the services that we refer on to, community paediatricians for ASD assessments is by far the most familiar, and this information was taken from our service evaluation in 2019-2020. We're currently in the process of doing our evaluation for both the primary and secondary schools at the moment, but when we have that data, I have no doubt that this would have increased by far. And I think one of the things to consider is in terms of referring young people for ADHD assessments and referring young people for communication needs assessments, they are what we generally will see. There are many reasons, I think, why we might see this in terms of following a speech and language assessment under this project in particular. And I think when we talk about females, we have assessed a lot of females under this project. And one of the things that was identified, and you might remember from the slide previously when Diz was talking about masking, and what we know from females in particular is that they can be very good at masking difficulties. And one of the things that our speech and language team developed was effectively a girls and communication needs checklist, if you like, where alongside the referral from school, what we will ask in certain situations is that checklist is completed to look at whether or not there are any underlying kind of, if you like, needs related to that child in terms of masking, deflecting, any behaviours, where if we're starting to consider that a communication needs from an ASD assessment is required. So it's really useful to consider that as the project has moved forward and we've been able to pick up on certain things, ASD referrals for young females being one of the probably biggest, I would say, is that we've then been able to develop the project and the resources and the support and what we're asking of schools, but what we're also offering schools. Okay, so coming on to the training. So this is a big part of this project, and it's where we invest a lot of time and resources in terms of the speech and language team. So although we offer the speech and language training to the primary and the secondary provisions and the college that engages with this project, I think it's useful to consider kind of what we do more broadly as well, because when we come on to talk about a whole system approach, which we're trying to change kind of more positively for children, it's useful to consider kind of where this sits. And our speech and language therapy team have done training to schools, police, the courts, our appropriate adult service, our mentors, which sit under our youth resilience project, youth justice staff, housing providers, youth offending panel members. And so in order to be able to support people to identify and be able to manage and support young people better, this training kind of sits within PRE, but actually we do this as a service in terms of we offer it out to as many services, organisations that feel it would be of benefit. So in terms of what this training will look like, it's completely free. It's very much needs dependent. So when a provision says that they would like some training, it may be that they want bespoke training because they've identified as a school that they have a particular area that they would like to develop staff kind of knowledge and experience and skills. So it could be around processing, it could be around expressive language, it could be around emotional literacy. So there could be a bespoke package that our speech and language therapists put together. But then what we've also had is we've had provisions that have said that they want all of their staff team trained. And I think the most we had was 150 school members that came along to a training kind of event. And effectively it was basic speech and language training. Now, what we do say is that although a greater amount of staff can be trained using kind of that approach, what we deliver is kind of your basic speech and language training package, if you like. But actually, with the smaller training groups, we've been able to do some pro-social modelling in terms of what does supporting a child within the classroom look like? How could actually a school develop further in terms of key members of staff that have contact with the children? So it could be behavioural staff, SENCOs, various staff, but actually those that may well have a significant influence and impact going forward for that child. And just to give some examples of the sort of areas that are covered within the training, we look at causes of behaviour, which we'll come on to a little bit further. We look at interventions such as comic strips, social stories. We've done some recent work with provisions around anxiety and ASD. We've identified within some provisions that further work around kind of time and organisation is required to support staff to understand if a child is persistently running late or if a child is really struggling to tell the time, maybe looking at school expectations of those children. So although we identify obviously and assess individual children, we are starting to understand and acknowledge trends and patterns within provisions and be able to support them moving that forward. And this slide is just to give a bit of an essence really in terms of what's come back from the speech and language training from the provisions that have been trained under this project. And I think what it kind of shows really is that for different provisions, it will impact depending on what their needs are differently. And so for some people, actually having a school team that is trained in SLCN and it's a more general training package can be really important. And for others, they found that those smaller groups and being able to have that bespoke training on certain elements of SLCN has been really useful. And so this was to kind of give a bit of an essence really in terms of what's come back so far. Okay, so in terms of what are we trying to achieve? So we offer individual speech, language and communication needs assessments, and we support schools with consultations and training. But in terms of what we are attempting to develop is effectively systemic resilience. So what we mean by that is effectively we want provisions to be able to look at their approach and be able to make it more positive for children and young people where they have assessed SLCM. And so effectively what we're looking at is that often environments need to change for children and young people, not the child or young person itself. So it's being able to create a positive experience for children and actually reduce the likelihood or the impact of them having negative situations within education in the future. So effectively, we want to support the provisions to be able to make those positive changes and actually really influence the school cultures. And speech and language is part of that. It's much wider, but for us in terms of this project, it's very much focusing on speech and language. And so what we're looking to do is to move from those individual assessments that we complete for the children and actually look at where the changes can be made in terms of supporting them as individuals, but then also looking at changing like a whole school approach. So moving from the micro being the individual up to the macro being the culture of what's adopted over that school. And as I said previously, this is part of something wider that we do in Milton Keynes around upskilling our partners to look at environments to be able to tailor themselves to meet the needs of children and young people more, including police, including courts. And that very much aligns in terms of children that have experienced adversity, trauma, etc. So it's being able to kind of look at the environments that children will find themselves in, and then actually look at taking that further and having a positive impact if they do come into those systems.
About 5 minutes, guys.
Okay.
Thank you. And so this is just to kind of reiterate really in terms of one of the biggest things that we kind of endorse, if you like, within this project and overall within the speech and language team is looking at behaviour, and that behaviour is communication. And then actually what we want to do is we want to encourage a paradigm shift in how children and young people's problematic behaviour is viewed. And this is kind of key really in terms of all of the aspects that we offer under this particular model. Okay, and then this effectively is endorsing what I've just said in the previous slide. So it's looking at all of the different systems within a school, looking at how a school can promote a positive culture. So whether that be from the head of the year, the head teacher, down to pastoral staff, behavioural mentors, etc. It's looking at the whole school adopts an approach to make that environment more positive for children and young people with speech and language needs.
Yeah, I think one of the key bits, which I think this illustrates, is it's making those lateral linkages within the school, so that you're not just dealing with the kind of hierarchical linkages, and also specifically making better communications between things like the SEN stream and the pastoral stream, where you get children that will go down one side or another, or they'll go down SEN or behavioural. That is one of the biggest things that we've identified, is that those children that tend to be coming through the behavioural route have their SEN needs have not even been considered an awful lot of the time.
And just bearing in mind time, I think it's really useful to come on to, okay, well, what have we found so far? So we did our secondary schools service evaluation back in 2019. It had some really promising results. So 21.42% of the students that had an assessment had a reduction in the number of fixed term suspensions that they received from their referral date, which was from the 31st of March 2020. Our evaluation in 2019 also indicated that 64% of the students that had an assessment didn't go on to receive a further fixed school exclusion, and that's within a period of a year. And only 7.14% of the students that were assessed for SLCN went on to receive a further suspension, and again within a year. And the primary and secondary pre-evaluation is currently in process. Delayed slightly due to the pandemic, because that did have an impact on this project. What we found is that schools weren't referring children, a lot of children weren't in school, but even kind of key working children that were attending, the project did see a reduction in the amount of children that were referred over that period. And I'm just going to touch upon this just because of time purely. And it was just looking at kind of the societal cost of late intervention, and what we can see there in terms of the amount of money that is spent in terms of school absence and exclusions, which is very costly, obviously, in terms of financially. But what we also see is there is an individual cost as well in terms of not intervening early enough. And the impact on that child and young person can be quite considerable, given kind of the ages upon which they are, which this kind of demonstrates really in terms of the life opportunities and the chances that that young person may go on to receive. Are we okay? Are we in time?
It's absolutely fantastic. I would even say it was a riveting response. We've had some fantastic questions, and I've been putting them in the chat pane as we've been going along. And so I think the burning question for many is, how the hell did you afford this? In terms of the number of, first of all, how many speech and language therapists have you got to deliver this extensive program, but How was it funded? How did you manage to
Right.
get people together to
So,
make it
so,
happen?
so the complex funding, we actually have quite a complex funding picture in Milton Keynes of our speech and language. So I'll kind of go through it incrementally, which might seem slightly counterintuitive. The original funding we got for speech and language therapy was back in 2008, where I convinced the Youth Justice Board that I could misappropriate the Keeping Young People in Education grant to pay for a 4-month pilot to have a speech and language therapist come in to look at our cohort. And that was after Karen Bryan's original research, looking at the sort of numbers. Now, what I deliberately did is, to some degree, skewed that assessment when they were coming in. So I didn't want them to assess everybody. I wanted them to assess in key areas. And the areas I pointed them towards were children who'd had greater level of education kind of disruption, be that through exclusion or part-time timetables or other bits, and those children who were involved in more prevalent reoffending. Interestingly enough, by focusing in on those two areas, the speech and language assessment identified that 88% of those children in those two cohorts had speech language communication needs. So that kind of gave us a good start. So we then got, we sort of carried on using the Youth Justice Grant for those, so effectively that was 2 days a week at that point. And then our colleagues in SEND picked up the bill for that. So they paid for 2 days per week speech and language therapy. However, the more we went on, the more we started assessing progressively wider and wider cohorts within the system. We needed new money to be able to justify getting more speech and language therapists. So we approached NHS England under the Health and Justice pathway. And through that, we got funding for another 2 days of speech and language time. As that sort of progressed on, that became the early support project, which has now been going since the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. That progressed on, immediately demonstrates its benefits, because we were looking at reoffending rates, which I think are currently at 3.7%.
3.17%.
3.17%, sorry. So that's using the reoffending rate, the same sort of 2-year measure as we'd used within the youth justice system. So the early support project demonstrates its worth in terms of getting a reoffending rate of 3.17%. On the back of that, I went and got further, so what we're up to now, we're up to 4 days of speech and language time. So we got further funding from the NHS England to increase those by another 2 days. So that took us up to 6 days. And then we finally got, which was for the introduction of pre. So those extra 2 days were focused explicitly on the pre project. And then we had a further 2 days of speech and language time, which were initially funded through a knife crime project within Milton Keynes through a counsellor's individual thing, but they are now being funded through Turnaround. So we have 8 days of speech and language time per week. That's term time only, sadly. So we have a bit of a gap in the holidays, but that is the kind of the total. And the total cost per annum of that is around £120,000. So it's easier to break it down into those £30,000 chunks for every 2 days is the best way of thinking of it. So I totally understand that doesn't fit within everybody's budget. It doesn't fit within everyone's sort of achievability. But in terms of the getting it in place and proving its worth, I think that we've done that through a whole series. I mean, we've been inspected now, I think 4 different inspections have we had? Yeah, 4 different inspections in Milton Keynes, each of which has kind of held up the model that we're using around ESP and including pre as being an effective model. So I think in terms of your outcomes and in terms of your defensibility for the model, it's money well spent.
And I think from my angle, observing practice around the country, I almost call the work you're doing pre-diversion diversion, because the child first agenda within the Ministry of Justice is about diversion once a child has become almost a part of a youth justice pathway. What you are doing is going to that tributary. And another follow-on question from that is what assessment tool is being used? So Gary has talked about in Knots they've adapted the Asset Plus tool. Is there a specific tool that?
Yes, there's number 2. So the main assessment tools that the speech and language therapists use is CAL5, but they use, so that's a whole series of mini assessments within that overarching assessment, and we use kind of 4 main areas there, and for the life of me I can't remember what they are, so that's really helpful. But we can send that information out sort of afterwards. But on top of that, they also use a number of other observational approaches, and I'm trying to think what the other is. It British? No, I can't think what the other tools that they use. But there's effectively they've got a whole catalogue of different tools that they will use depending on the individual needs of the child. So there is a definite sort of tailoring of the tools to that individual child, and this is why it all comes down to why we use speech and language therapists rather than trying to train up practitioners to do these assessments or screening. I mean, the irony being that Milton Keynes was one of the we were involved in the development of the screening tool that is ultimately included within Asset Plus, but we tend not to screen, we assess everybody. Yeah. So it's the kind of like, so even though we developed that, we recognize rather the limitations of screening, because you're non-specialist practitioners trying to identify a need that actually is a specialist area.
Yeah,
and that triangulates again with the 60 youth offending teams we're working with as part of the quality assurance framework. The frontline professionals have training to raise their levels of professional curiosity, to go deeper. The specialists are brought in to uncover this. There was a good question from Annabelle. She asked about how is your training, say, to schools different to the out-of-the-box training from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists or ICAM or some of the wider generic training? Is it specifically around, I suppose it's the how needs are expressed and then how they're dealt with? I don't know, how is it?
Well, I was going to say I'll start and then let Jenna carry on. I was involved in the development both of the ICANN training, which was originally under the Communication Trust, and also the box training, so I'm very aware of what's involved in sort of both of those. So there are similarities. It does overlap with both of those. And what I would suggest, though, is that the key difference is that it is entirely bespoke to the provision we're providing the training to. So
and matched to the needs of the kids that are in that setting, because that's how you made the link.
Yeah,
absolutely. And just taking that further, I think that's in terms of why we kind of find it really important to look at kind of trends and patterns that are coming out in terms of not just the kind of identified needs of children, but of the school settings in terms of what are they requiring additional support for. So whether it be timing, organisation, language, processing, etc., it's very much bespoke to what that school has recognised themselves as there is a gap within their kind of knowledge, but also in terms of us being able to say, okay, we've assessed, say, 10 children, we're identifying that this is kind of a difficulty within this setting. Shall we come in and kind of look at how you might be able to use social stories to look at that, comic strips, etc. So I think it's kind of a pairing really between, it's a bit of a partnership between the schools and ourselves.
Wonderful.
I think sorry,
just a follow-up question here about the governance of your SALT team. What's the overall sort of leadership and management structure? Because you've got the funding from different sources. How have you got that commonality?
Yeah.
So they all come under the local SALT service. So Jenna manages them in-house, but they're actually managed by the speech and language service in Milton Keynes. So despite they're coming through all those different funding, they are all part of the same core team, and they link into the wider SLT network. So a number of them actually have additional days that they do within schools. One of them has additional days that she does within Oak Hill Secure Training Centre. So they actually integrate into sort of the wider speech and language services. So they're not standalone and sort of operating in isolation.
Fantastic. Conscious of, we've got about 6 minutes left. Colleagues out there listening, thank you for your questions. We'll try and cover them all. I would absolutely love you to leave a comment, positive or otherwise, of how you felt today. It will go, because we want to run some more of these. We want to run them every month, and your comments, every single person's comments will be valued. Please leave a comment as we're going. One of the great questions that's been asked is, how have you managed to get schools to get involved? Which is a very, very good question.
Well, I think I was going to say I'll let Jenna go there with the hook.
Yeah, very, very good question. So initially, I think it was very much so I approached and targeted kind of the schools that we'd identified from our kind of 2-year analysis, and went to those schools. And effectively, it felt like I was doing a bit of a sales pitch. So I'd kind of moved my background in social work. I'd moved kind of from there into like sales. But you know what, actually, I think what the schools were recognising is that actually a real, I suppose, an enthusiasm for a service and a project that had come along to say, okay, the trajectory for some children and young people when they're excluded from school or they're educated in alternative provisions or they're absent for whatever reason, can be poor, and that can lead them into youth justice kind of systems. Actually, we want to help you do something, and we want to identify needs earlier. And if this is all free, then absolutely fantastic. That was one of the biggest hooks. But it was speaking to the right people, being able to make sure that we were really kind of giving that message that this is actually to support schools. So this isn't about us coming in, identifying lots of children with SLTN and then just leaving. This is actually about us saying we recognise that this can be really difficult. There is free training. We want to have an open kind of door consultation approach with you. And I think it was the method upon which we were kind of selling the project, if you like, that actually really kind of hooked the schools in. And to have 29 provisions in Milton Keynes, there's only a handful that actually aren't working with us. And often that's because they have their own speech and language therapist.
Interesting. That's fantastic. And it sounds to me like an absolute win-win-win. If less young people are being fixed term excluded, it is likely that yes, young people will be permanently excluded, and ergo less people will enter youth justice pathways. So eventually, this front end funding is going to, if we just talk cash,
Yeah.
is going to have a profound impact on where
And,
money is spent in Milton Keynes.
And I think that's one of the, if you go back to the Audit Commission, did a study back in 2004 looking at the youth justice system. And there was a case study there of James, who was a young person who went through the youth justice system, who didn't have his special education needs, didn't have his speech and language needs identified, and ended up in custody. And they managed to put a price on it. And they basically said, if his needs had been identified at the earliest point, it would have cost, I think it was 17,000. Because they weren't, it cost an additional £140,000 to meet his needs. Now, that was 2004. And at that point, they extrapolated that we just did that in 1 in 10 of the circumstances where that applied to James, that would save the public purse £100 million a year. So this was kind of like, you know, a ridiculous, to me, it is, as you say, it's a no-brainer. That all of this is about investing earlier and earlier, and the systemic knock-on effect of that, because you're going up the tributaries, you are stopping these problems coming further down the line, which cost all of society, not just the youth justice system, a huge amount of money. And so it's, you know, do I sound sort of a bit like a kind of, I don't know, a preacher going out and preaching it? Well, I make no apologies to that, because I think that this is about trying to change the way that we approach children with complex needs in the system, and how we actually get in there earlier, and we are far more compassionate, far more kind of empathetic, and far more, you know, community oriented in the way that we work, rather than allowing them to come into the system where they are automatically being labelled, stigmatized, and dealt with in a more kind of discriminatory way.
We at Microlink, we are co-sponsoring a school improvement program called Raising Attainment with Wellbeing. We're putting well-being at the heart of things. We thought it'd be a slow burner, but we've had 300 schools join the program already, and it very much takes what is trauma-informed awareness kind of approach into something tangible. What you're doing is driving that understanding into the heart of the system. Guys, it's 1 minute to go. You have been absolutely amazing. I wonder if you wouldn't mind typing into the chat pane your email addresses, because I know a couple of people would like to get in touch. If you wouldn't mind doing that. And colleagues, thank you for your comments. Keep those comments going. We'll have the webinar open for another 10 minutes, just to enable you to put any comments you have or observations. My intense thanks to Jenna. My intense thanks to Diz. In a month's time, we're going to have another youth offending service that's done things slightly different, but this time it's a systemic change. We hope to show how people can work together in different ways, and every month we're going to feature another way of doing things. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending the webinar. Thank you, Diz. Thank you, Jenna. And if you do want to stay on and actually have a question just for the last few minutes that you might just want to speak to Jenna or Diz about, please stay
I
on.
was going to say we're
Put up a
happy to
hand.
stay on. Like any people who've got questions that they would like to ask them, please do.